Blake, we're going to be getting into it more formally in a second here, but if you had to sum up most companies, super generalizing here, right? But most companies with their training program, how would you sum it up in 2 words? I'll go
It's
first.
great.
Really boring. That's what I would say. Most companies for training and development, it's boring. Because I
Yeah.
think a lot of companies, they just don't create engaging content. We've got a lot of stuff on the docket today when it comes to learning, development, and building out training programs that are engaging amongst many other things that we'll cover. But for those who don't know, my name is Cameron Collins. I'm a revenue operations strategist with RevPartners. I'm a community manager for Sprocketeer, one of the largest independent communities for HubSpot admin. Got my co-host Mark, director of growth marketing at DealHub, and we've got our guest Blake, who is the founding AE with Super and was an awesome sales rep with HubSpot. Blake, I'll let you go ahead and tell everyone just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So a little bit about myself. I was over at HubSpot as a strategic channel account manager for a while. It's actually how I met Cameron. Very thankful for that opportunity. Shifted gears over to Supered about 6, 7 months ago. And the topic today actually has a lot to do with why I made the switch. I got fed up with the old system of doing things. Back to Cameron's original question of like, how do I sum up learning and development currently, especially at bigger publicly traded companies like HubSpot? I wouldn't even necessarily say boring. I would say ineffective. And the way the, I don't want to offend anybody, but that's the reality. I had a month of training when I started at HubSpot, and it's all based on their learning and development program. And I think I retained about 2% of that going into the program. Same with my coworkers. So when I got introduced to a different way of doing things, it got me really excited to the point that I left a very established company to go start with a brand new startup. So I'm really excited and passionate about this topic.
I'm right there with you because I built my career on sales leadership, sales management, and building and coaching sales reps and helping them in their careers. And what I'd found is that anytime a company was creating resources that were intended to be helpful, oftentimes for myself, again, I use the term boring, but ineffective works as well. It oftentimes is intended to help with a very specific thing that maybe people don't always need help with in that moment. And I know obviously you work with Supered, and we'll talk likely a little bit about specifically how that plays into things. But I think definitely one of the problems with many of the more traditional solutions is that they are so specific in what a company is trying to coach and train somebody on, whether it's new employee onboarding or ongoing learning and development, and it doesn't cater to what people are actively in need of learning in a given moment. And I know that we've talked a little bit about the different types of solutions for learning and development. Candidly, as probably most people who aren't super familiar with this space, I just use the term LMS as a catch-all for a learning development tool, but turns out that's not the case. So before we talk about some of our very strong opinions, go ahead and educate us on some of the different tools and resources and what the different types of solutions even are in the space.
Yeah, that's a great place to start because learning development, it seems like there's a new tool every day that comes out. But the main categories that I like to lump things into is the first one's LMS. And I want to go through pros and cons of each to give you examples of what is an LMS versus these other tools. So, an LMS is going to be software designed to train and validate things with your team. So, it's like your traditional content where it might be a mix of video, it might be some PDFs, might be like some mini quizzes, but the whole idea is you're like a college course. You're going through your absorbing the learning, hopefully, and then validating that via a quiz or a test. And then the company's hoping that you apply that to your job. So that's what we mean by LMS is you're training and then validating via a test. Your other tools are going to be like a digital adoption platform, for example. And I forgot one key point. LMS is typically always off platform of what your users are using, whereas a digital adoption platform's in the systems your team is using. So it's like an overlay. So the good part with this is it drives process for adoption. So it's actually having your users use the tools they use every day, which is much better, in my opinion, at least, than like reading a course and taking a quiz. It's typically going to have the training embedded in the tools, so they don't have to leave your tool to go take the course. They could get the learning when they need it. And then it's going to help you measure adoption and see if your teams are actually adopting what you're teaching them. So it's definitely a step in the right direction compared to LMS, but it is quite a bit different in the way it's delivered. And then the last category I like to lump things into is working instructions. This is like apps like Scribehow, if you've heard of them, or Tango. But essentially, it's the ability to create how-to guides to walk a user step by step on how to do a specific task. So that one's very tactical of, I'll give you an example. How do I create a deal in HubSpot? Or how do I make an opportunity in Salesforce? Work instructions actually walk them step by step where to click and how to do it. It's very powerful, but it's missing that component of how do I teach them why this is important and like what happens once you do this process. So those are the three systems that I like to lump things into: LMS, digital adoption platform, and then working instructions.
I'm going to get myself fired up over here because when it comes to, again, learning and development as a whole, I don't think there's probably anybody who's listening who was going to say everybody has to learn the same way. I think by now most people will agree that people have different preferred methods of how they want to learn. And even speaking for myself, sometimes I learn really well depending on my environment and what I'm learning, being very hands-on. Let me do it and I'll figure it out. Sometimes I prefer video content, and it depends what I'm doing, what my environment is. And I think having a tool or a learning platform that's multimodal, super, super important. But not just multimodal, it's allowing people to learn what they need in the moment. And I know, like we've mentioned, Super. One of the things that I really like about using that as a learning platform is if I create a deal in HubSpot and I leave a property off that's supposed to be a required property, it's going to pop up with a big red box that says, hey, don't forget to fill out this property. And that box stays on that deal until I go back and do it. And that is much more effective than me having my manager tell me, hey, you had 10 deals last month that didn't have this property filled out. Go complete these tasks until the report says zero, right? Like there's ways of learning development where you take what people want and need to learn and you put it right in front of them. And again, we've talked about Super being a really good example of a tool that helps with that. But what are some of the hallmarks of creating content that is going to allow somebody to learn well? Is there anything that you've seen that makes content more engaging, short form, long form, using GIFs? Do you have any opinions on what makes good content for learning and development?
Yeah, I think the most helpful way to frame this for people watching is going to be covering the shortcomings, because that will help us understand like why my recommendations are what they are. So if we look at the shortcomings, we'll just do it platform by platform. If we look at an LMS, what's the typical problem? Typically, it's going to be like a 20-minute to 2-hour course. So it's very long form. It's just blocks of text. It's slide decks. It's training videos. It's like an overload of content. And especially when you're talking about sales teams, they're not going to want to sit there for 2 hours and go through this course. They're probably going to take it over 3 or 4 days or play it on 2x speed. So way one of how not to do it. Long form, in my opinion, is the worst thing you can do for teams, because you're interrupting their day and asking them to sit down for even 20 minutes is a long time, but lots of these courses are like an hour long. So it's not effective when it's long form. So I think step one is you need short form, bite-sized content that helps them with a very specific targeted problem. Because if I have to go look through 10 different videos to find the exact problem I'm having, I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to go ask my coworker. I'm going to go ask my boss. I'm going to submit a ticket to ops to ask them how to do something. I'm just going to ignore that tool even exists. So that's problem one, is long form. Problem two is going to be you need context. So if you're just telling people how to do something, it's not going to stick as well as if you're telling them why they need to do it and why it's going to help them in their day to day. Because at the end of the day, like the whole reason people don't adopt CRMs, don't adopt marketing platforms, don't adopt SaaS tools in general is they don't view it as helping their workflow day to day. They view it as like something taking away where they have to go do data entry or do this. So if you can make the training applicable and explain when you do this, it's going to trigger these automations that are going to help you do your job because of XYZ, you're much more likely to have that lesson stick and have people actually follow the process. And then the last one for me is putting it where you're going to work. So I'm taking this from a sales lens because I've been in sales for far too long at this point. But the biggest pet peeve of mine as a salesperson is when I'll use HubSpot, for example. If I had a question on how to do something, I would have to go to our Confluence wiki and search for it. And typically, I'm not even exaggerating, it would take me like 15 to 20 minutes to find the right result because there's so much in that wiki. So I'd do one of two things. I'd completely wing it and break something. And that was probably my default because I was like, I just want to get this done and I hope this works. Or two, I would not do anything and wait for my manager to bring it up and have her show me how to do it. Because I was just like, I'm going to move on to something more important. How do you fix that? You have bite-sized learnings that are actionable and explain why you need to do it and what it's going to do for you inside the tool that your team's using. Because then they don't have to go off platform. They don't even have to switch the page they're on in the tool. They just click a button and it's going to have that bite-sized training of here's how to do it. Here's why you're going to do it. Here's what's going to happen after you do it. And it gets rid of all of those issues that you have with traditional LMS, traditional digital adoption platforms, and traditional work instructions. It's combining it all together so I know what I need to do, why it's important and what it's going to do, and how to do it, all without leaving the task I'm doing right now.
I have a question because in a previous role, I was for a time in charge with like activation of customers on our product and had to become versed in all of those growth hacks and things like that. Where do you think like gamification falls into the scope of all of this, especially when we're talking about like internal training, like gamifying, is it kind of corny or is there a way to make it where people actually get into it?
That's a hard one because you can gamify things multiple ways. I think what gamification comes down to is like, how's it going to help me? Because that's what we're ultimately trying to do. Because like when somebody's not doing an action you want them to do, I typically see a couple different reasons for that. One is they don't know what's going to happen when they do that. So it's the fear of the unknown of if I do X, what is going to happen? Am I going to break something? Is it going to send an email to a client? So they just default to not doing it. So even if you gamify it, they're still probably not going to do it because they're afraid of what's going to happen when they do it because they don't understand the process. As far as like actually gamifying it goes, I'm a strong believer in that because, like I said, I'm coming from a sales lens and salespeople love things that are gamified. So, like, some ways I've seen that is like spiffs based on people that are doing the right processes and things like that. That's been really effective. I'll give you an example. So, at my last startup, Divvy, what they did really well is gamifying sales for us and helping us compete head to head in a healthy way. So what that looked like is we'd have a promo for a week of, hey, the people that got the most SQLs in the system that are validated by their manager will get a $100 gift card to take a client out to lunch or to take your family on a vacation, not vacation, $100 isn't enough, but to take them out to dinner or something like that. You could do like little things like that to gamify it. As far as like on the client success end, I haven't really worked in that space, so I'm not sure what would be effective there. But I think before you gamify, you have to help people understand what do I want you to do and what's going to happen when I do it. Because otherwise, you could offer them 10 grand to go do it, and then they don't know what's going to happen and they're scared of it. They're not going to do it, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think gamification is helpful for creating tactical training exercises. So, to your point, who can get the most SQLs in a period of time? Or first one to, if you have a HubSpot admin boot camp and you're doing first one to build XYZ workflow wins, right? There are tactical ways to gamify a learning and development situation. What I find annoying is when they gamify something with, like, it's got the kitschy graphics and they try to make like an actual point and click game out of something that doesn't need to be. We've all been through those old style learning development programs, and I don't know why they continue to persist. No one wants to do the point and click game of this is what you should do. And it's got the really bad graphics. And I feel like maybe that's starting to go away. But yeah, I think that gamification works for real tactical training environment situations, needs to go away for the education piece, if you will, for some of those like kitschy old time videos and such.
I'm interested in your perception, Cameron, because you work with clients all the time. What do you see as the biggest blocker with learning and development?
So I used the term boring before, and I'm going to go back to that because I really think that making it boring is half of what makes training suck for everybody. Nobody wants to listen to or watch a video that is monotone. Nobody wants to listen to and watch a video that's 20 minutes long that is theoretical, but doesn't give them a practical how to on something, right? And then nobody wants to digest content that also not just is boring, but is not relevant to them. So this goes back to, I know we've talked about why Super is good for this, in the sense that you can put what somebody needs to be doing in front of them based on the environment of HubSpot. But even if we take Super out of the equation, I was never good in school. And so, using myself as an example, being told what I needed to do, when I needed to learn it, and how I needed to learn it, hated it. And same thing has always applied to me in the workplace. If I'm in sales and I'm crushing my close rate, but they want to pull me into an hour-long training on how to close better and how to close deals, and I'm sitting here like, why am I wasting an hour of my life? Maybe teach me how to go out and prospect if that's where my weakness is. But I think every company has fallen victim to saying we're rolling out a blanket training program on whatever we think is important because the company thinks it's important. And now you're pulling people into a training environment that they don't want to be in. You're forcing them to learn content that isn't relevant to them in that moment. And even if the content's engaging, you've already lost because they don't care.
So you're saying to make it easier, more effective, you essentially need to have more ways that a user can interact with the learning and development content. Because some people learn better in a live session, some learn better from long form videos, some already know what they know and they only need little bits and pieces, so they might need micro learning.
Yeah.
Is that what you're kind of saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, again, like I use Supered. So this I promise this podcast is not a plug for Supered, but it's relevant because it works so well for HubSpot, for learning and development. But the point is, I will create a card on how to create a contact. And I will have that card with a map, click through how to create a contact. I will have a 30-second video, how to create a contact, me explaining it. And I will have the text, bullet points, how to create a contact. Some people are going to look at the map. Some people want the video. Some people want the text. Takes a long time to build it out. Takes a lot of effort. It's probably over-engineered for 60% of people, but 30% are going to one method, 30% are going to like another, and 30% are going to like another. And do I think it's feasible for every company to do that with every single piece of information and get it done in 30 days? No. But if you have a learning and development specialist or an HR team and that's what they're focused on, learning and development is taking information that people care about and presenting it to them in a way that is digestible and interesting and engaging. And so if you are telling me, here's how to create a contact, and you're only telling me that one way, I might read the bullets. Am I going to retain it? Maybe not. If I go back, is it going to help me to retain it? Maybe not. But if I have a video and bullets and a map, now we're cooking.
Gotcha. Mark, what's your perception on this? Because it sounds like you've been there, you've done that. Do you have the same view, or
Yeah,
what's your
I
view on
mean,
how to make it work?
learning in general is is ironic as it is, it's my last name, but learning in general is a weird thing for me because it's hard for me to put myself in the place of someone who learns quote unquote normally because I don't. I always had trouble in school. The way I learn is, I think, very backwards. Like I can't follow the normal routine of steps in a course or whatever. Like I always go skip to the end and then try to do the last thing and then work my way backwards trying to figure out what are the things I need to know to do that, if that makes sense. It's like reading the book from the end, but that because I just don't have patience to go through the whole thing. I concede that most people are not like that. What I found to be really so that some of the stuff Cameron was talking about, especially like the corporate thing where you're like, you have to do this module on whatever, and they're just like really corny. Is a way someone is just checking something off on a box and they just need you to do it. I actually have a question for you. You were saying that in your HubSpot days, you would have to go to this massive like Confluence document and it took forever. How do you think that might be different now with the advent of AI and like the retrieval methods that make like chatbots with access to that documentation able to give you like an answer that's much easier than having to sift through all it?
I'm torn on that one because AI still relies on the data set being good. And the reason I say that is part of the reason our wiki was such a disaster is I'll use comp plan, for example. If I search comp plan in Confluence when I was at HubSpot, I'd get like 50 results and it'd be comp plan 2012, comp plan 2018, 2022, and it'd be all over the place. So if I used AI to be like, what is my comp plan? Some comp plans would say, hey, this is comp plan 2024, but other comp plans from past that they just didn't delete or archive, it'd literally just say comp plan. You'd have to click on it and you'd have to see the year it was published. Is insanity.
Yeah,
Like our database was so messy. If you add AI to it, it probably will make it more confusing because you're going to think it's the right result, but it's an outdated document unless you take the time to look at when it's published and if there's newer ones that are published.
right.
So could it be helpful? Yes, but it still requires somebody to be maintaining that database, getting rid of old stagnant processes and documents that don't apply anymore, and making sure that the most up-to-date ones are the ones that are being served in the results. So there's two ways you could do that. One, you could also make a document of how to use the AI so that you get good results and then cross your fingers that reps and employees actually listen to how to do it properly. Or two, somebody's full-time job at a company with 10,000 people would literally have to be going through and managing that wiki, archiving old past processes that are no longer existing. And even at HubSpot, we didn't have that person to do that. I'm not exaggerating. When I would search for things, I'd get results from like 2015 and 2018 where that thing doesn't even exist anymore in our internal systems.
Mm-hmm.
Can it be helpful? I think 100%. It's undeniable that AI makes us work better. The problem is if your data sucks, it's not going to fix that.
Yeah. You have kind of strong feelings when it comes to where LMSs are in today's market, right? How do you feel about them and why do you feel that way?
So I think this goes into what the core problem is. And the core problem is how we learn as humans.
Yeah.
So if you look at all the stats, there's like the forgetful curve, and there's actual data and studies of within the first week of taking a training, whether it's via LMS, a live training, a one-on-one training, it doesn't matter what type, that person loses 90% of what they learned. So the reason I'm so passionate about this is learning in general is broken, not just LMS. If you look at universities, if you look at businesses, if you look at live training, sales training, it just does not work because you're missing a core component that every good learning and development program needs, and that is constant reskilling. So yes, you need to have that lesson to teach the concept and process and what people need to do, but you need to also have that in the system they use so they can reference it when they're doing that process. Because like back to Cameron's example of how to create a contact, I'll take that training and I might not use that training for 3 months. And the odds of me remembering what to do is next to zero, in my opinion. Like, you're going to go ask your buddy how to do it. You're going to go ask your manager, and you're probably going to do it wrong because you have no clue what you learned from 3 months ago. So like for an effective program, like my main takeaway of how to make your system not suck is having those trainings directly in your tool so that when I'm doing that process and I need to remember how to do it, I can just click a button and it comes up with a card or comes up with a document that says, okay, here's working instructions on how to do it. Here's a quick 30-second video on how to do it. And here's a text example step by step of how to do it as well. Because then you're validating what they learned and it's more likely to stick because you're seeing it multiple times. And people are actually going to look at it because they don't have to leave to go off platform to go figure out how to do it. So that's my opinion is traditional learning, you have to have it. There's no way around it. There's never going to be a company that will not have a formal learning process, in my opinion. But where everybody's missing the mark, including HubSpot, which is like renowned for their training programs internally, there's next to zero reskilling and retraining. You just take the training and then when you need it, you hope that you remember it and you never do. So to be effective, you need some way to embed those micro learnings directly where your people are working, showing them what they're supposed to be doing. So when they actually need to do it, it's sitting right there. They don't have to go find a coworker. They don't go find a manager. They don't have to spend 20 minutes looking through a wiki to figure out, oh, is it this document or what's the search that I need to put into the AI search engine? No, it's right in front of your face. You click a button, it tells you what to do. Lots of people will probably hate that, but if you're only doing one-time trainings, it's never going to.
Before I hear Blake and Mark respond to this, for anyone who's listening live on LinkedIn right now, what I want you to do is in the comments, type agree or disagree to the following.
Oh,
A hallmark of a bad training and development or learning and development system is if somebody asks you a question, you're a manager, you're a learning and development person, you're in HR, somebody asks you a question and the answer is in your documentation or in your learning and development system. And rather than send them a link to your system with your pre-made answer, you're taking the time to give a response, whether live, type it out, whatever the case may be. Agree or disagree? That is an example of a bad learning development or training development system. Agree or disagree in the comments. And Mark, I want to hear your just
you're gonna
agree
have
or
to say
disagree.
it again. I'm like, I was trying to say the scenario again. I'm listening.
So I'm a rep. I ask
Yeah.
my manager a question.
Yeah.
And the answer is in the learning development system, but rather than just send me a link to a video, the manager says, oh, here's the answer. Because it would take longer or more work or more effort to go find the video, get the link, send it to the rep. So instead of doing all that, I'm going to explain the answer.
And that's bad?
I think that's bad. I think if you have a video that's recorded that your training team has created on how to create a contact, and a rep goes to their manager and says, how do I create a contact? If you're not sending the link to that video or that card in Supered or whatever that date and where the answer lives, you paid somebody to make a learning development resource for training development purposes to save your leadership team, your management team time in answering questions. And instead of relying on the resources that you built, they're using their time to answer these questions. I think that's a bad thing, right? So taking it again, we'll just take it back to Supered. I create a card on how to create a contact, and I go and somebody comes to me as a manager and says, how do I create a contact? Instead of me explaining how to create a contact, send them the Supered card, right?
Yeah.
I already built the answer.
I think that's the value of having it on product in context, as you said, right? So that keeps them within the product. Whereas if it was a video file or in Google Drive or YouTube and you sent it to them, it would take them out of the workflow that they're in. But I think in your scenario, so I'm gonna answer with a non-answer. I would say it depends on what it is that you're sending them.
Blake,
I'm somewhat, I'm going to have two answers to this just to make it more confusing.
do
I
it.
think if you have a traditional learning and development platform, you have to do it that way, where managers have to be equipped to answer the question and show them the process. Because there's no other way to do it. Like, you can't put it on platform. It's not easy to search or share. To your point, Cameron, it's probably going to take longer to go find it and send it to that person than just tell them how to do it. So I think under the current system, you almost have to. Is that the right way to do it? I strong disagree that's the right way to do it. Because you have tools out there, including Supered, where you can literally embed it right next to the name contact. You could have a little lightning bolt. When they click that lightning bolt, it's that training directly inside HubSpot or inside Salesforce or inside an ERP. So there's no reason anymore why you shouldn't direct them to that resource. Like, as long as they can click a button and read and follow along, like, they know how to do the process now. And the reason I think that's better is everybody teaches differently as well. So if I have a manager that explains something, I don't want to look dumb and tell her or him and be like, oh, I don't understand. Can you re-explain it? I'm just going to pretend I understand and try to do it. I'm probably going to do it wrong if I didn't understand it. But it's very unlikely that I'm going to be like, hey, I'm new at this company. I don't know what you're talking about. Can you re-explain it or jump on a Zoom call with me? So that's problem one. And problem two is, how do you ensure consistency? Because if it's something like a sales process, for your data to actually be accurate, you need people doing everything the same way through your company. So if one manager is saying, hey, this is how you create a contact, or this is when you create a deal, but it doesn't line up with your company's SOPs, your data is going to be wrong. One team might have a horrific close rate because they're opening a deal as soon as they prospect to them. And then another team might have a really good close rate because they're opening a deal when it's ready to close. So if you're making an SOP and you're not following that SOP because each manager's teaching it differently and not following the process, you might as well not even have a process. So that's a really long-winded way of saying, under the current system, you have to do it that way, but there's a better way to do it. And the reason you should do it that way is because you'll get consistency. Because if you're not consistent, nothing really matters. You might as well not even have a SOP, in my opinion. Am I crazy?
No. And I would add a point of clarification that the point is not the point wasn't to never answer a question. But if an employee is never going to the learning and development tools, which 90% of the time, I think for 90% of the companies is the case, right? Most of us, myself included, probably will just reach out to internal people, whether it's your manager or colleagues, and say, hey, quick question, can you help me out? But again, it's the fact that the theme is, how do we build training programs that don't suck? Right. And so if you have all these internal resources and the answer to some common questions or some static questions can easily be obtained through internal documentation, and if all of your employees are neglecting the usage of those internal resources, then why did you build this library of knowledge and training? And so it wasn't managers should never answer employee questions, but are they encouraging the use of the knowledge library? Are they not using it because they don't think it's helpful too? If your leadership team, if your managers aren't finding the learning and development and the training resources helpful and beneficial, then why is the employee? And I think a good example of where leveraging internal resources, and this is going to step away from Super, but at RevPartners, for example, we have a knowledge base of how to do certain things, how to set up lead scoring, how to set up life cycle stages, all kinds of stuff. And sometimes we, myself included, but strategists might ask a question where the answer is documented and there's videos and such. And occasionally the team will pull the video, drop it as a response, and say, hey, I think you might have missed this video. Go check it out. And a decent amount of the time, that answers the question because the information was there. Maybe we missed it. Maybe I forgot the video existed, whatever the case may be. Right. But they didn't have to take 20 minutes to type out a whole long articulate response. They were able to find a video in the pre-existing knowledge base, drop it as a response, and answer the question. And so I think that's an example of, again, not even referencing any specific tool, building information that exists that's helpful.
I have a question for you, Cameron. How do you make sure it's actually helpful? Because I've got a pretty strong opinion on this one, but I'd love your feedback on that, and also Mark's, of how do you make sure it's actually helpful to the user?
So I think in part it is creating depending on what the topic is. So is it a simple tactical, like how to add a property in HubSpot? And you can create viably, you can create a map on it, and you can record a short video, and you can add bullet points, add as many modals of learning that apply. If it's something longer and more theoretical, then expanding, I think, the documentation to be thorough can be helpful, but having it also broken into smaller bits. So having an overview video that says, hey, this is an hour and a half long course, but here's the 2-minute overview on what to expect. And so even where there might be longer videos on longer topics that are more detailed, I think that still having shortened bite-sized content helps people to learn and digest. Speaking largely for myself, but I think that being able to take longer concepts and break them down into bite-sized content when you can and where you can with overviews and abbreviations, I think that's helpful. But I am curious to hear, Mark and Blake, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to, I think just my brain's wired a little different. And so for me, the only way I learn is by doing and trying and failing, and then it won't stick unless I've tried it and figured it out on my own. Just that it's somewhat of it's a masochistic way of doing it because it's painful, takes forever, but it was the only surefire way that I'm more likely to go through some sort of text bullet points as a guide. But I think the idea of having multiple various types of media is a good fail safe, that there aren't any excuses that you haven't been given something that can help you.
Blake, your thoughts?
Throwing you the football.
My thoughts, I don't know if this will be controversial or not, but this has been my biggest pet peeve at every company I've worked at. People making learning and development documentation typically aren't the users that do that job.
For sure.
So my biggest thing, regardless of what tool you use, what documentation method you use, how you build it, what the content is, if you're not bringing in a group of users that you're making this for and like understanding how they do that process today and how you need to make it better, or if they're doing it right or wrong, you're missing the whole point in the first place. Because if you have somebody from operations that's highly technical, or not even highly technical, that's never done that before, they don't know how those users do it, and they might show a completely different way. Because HubSpot's a great example. You could create a deal on a contact record, on a company record, or on the deals tab. How's the team doing it now? I might make my documentation based on the deals tab, but every other team's making it on the contacts tab. It's like, if you're not talking to those users and putting yourself in their shoes, your training's never going to be effective, whether it's multiple different ways they could learn, like a video, text, and a map, or if it's some long training course. It's not going to matter, because they're going to go, hey, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, because we don't even do it that way. So I think you have to get user input and put yourself in their shoes, is my opinion. That may or may not be controversial.
Well, controversy here.
Well, okay, this then opens a really interesting topic, because I agree wholly that the people who are making the content either should be really darn good actors with great source and reference material so that the video or the content is convincing. Obviously, if you're typing documentation, who typed it is a little bit less relevant as long as the information is aligned and accurate and signed off. But especially when we're talking about video content, which is important, by the way, if you have a learning and development program or learning development content and you don't have video as a medium, then I think that's a huge area of opportunity for virtually every company where you'd be missing out. But I definitely think that the people who are making the content should be the ones who are in it and understand it. And so whether that's managers or it's your revenue operations admin or HubSpot admin or whoever that may be for your company, yeah, the people doing it should be making the content as well. And they should be comfortable making that content and explaining it and articulating it in a way that applies to the end user. Because the way that I talk to an executive about life cycle stages might be very different to explaining how to change life cycle stages or why they're important to the rep, right? So tailoring your messaging to the end user is important too. What I'm curious to hear your opinion on, Blake, is I know that we have probably quite a few listeners who are in the learning development space or in the human resources space. And so they are not the end user, but they are responsible for the learning and development and the culture of their team. How do people, in your opinion, who are not necessarily the end user or the HubSpot admin, how do they go about getting involved with making sure that content is relevant? What are some things when it comes to validation and enforcement of the content? Like, how do they get involved and what lens should they be looking at this through?
There's a plethora of ways of doing it. I'm a big advocate, and no team should be in a silo in any company, regardless of how big or small you are. Like, if you're in learning and development, you should be meeting with managers periodically. You should be meeting with the actual end users doing that process. So you can see, just get feedback of what's confusing about our system. Like, what processes do you not understand that aren't documented well? What is the bottleneck in your process? Because if you're not having those conversations, you're going to be on your own island just guessing on what people need help with. I really think step one is building those internal relationships of both power users and maybe some laggards as well to get a good context of what does the team actually need help with. Because I find, like, when I'm working with clients in my current job, lots of them make documentation for the sake of making documentation because that's their job. But if you actually have those relationships and understand what are the bottlenecks and what do people actually need to learn, people are actually going to use your content and they're going to start coming to you as well. They'll send you a Slack or an email saying, hey, Blake, I know you're in charge of this. I'm really struggling with XYZ process, or like what we're supposed to do after a deal closes on the handoff process. Can you either make this documentation cleaner or can you make new documentation to help me with this process? I think if you don't have that feedback loop, you're doomed to never be successful in that role. So I think that's step one. Step two is, I truly believe with the tech out there today, if you're not putting this enablement, especially the bite-size enablement, directly in the tools your team uses, you're missing the boat. Everybody has short attention spans nowadays, like the rise of TikTok and YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. You need to have it directly where it's easy to access or people aren't going to access it. So I think that's piece two is, can my user find this quickly in the app they're using it? If not, you need to go find a way to do it and buy a new tool. And I'm definitely open to that conversation selfishly. And then the last one is, you need a way to validate and enforce it to make sure people are actually using it. Because I think the biggest failure in training and development I've had in my career is, it's usually really good when you're a new employee. Like, you get all the resources you need, you have a support system. What happens 6 months, 12 months, 2 years into a job? You're disconnected from that team and you're not getting what you need. So if you don't have something built into the tools your team's using, telling them, hey, you did this correctly or you did this incorrectly, and then having a bite-sized training on how to do it correctly if it's flagged as incorrect, you're missing the boat because you're just focusing on your new employees that don't know anything. I feel like that's the biggest opportunity for businesses is, I've felt neglected at pest companies because I've been there for 2 years. And it's always, oh, when there's a new process, the employees that have been here for a month or two, they're the ones getting the training, and I'm just expected to know what it is and find it myself. So I think to wrap up that section, you need to put yourself in the user's shoes and build that feedback loop and not be off on your own island. You need some way to make it in-app so users get the content they need when they need it, so they don't wing it or have to go somewhere else. And then you need a way to validate that they're doing it correctly. So if they're not, even if it's somebody that's been there for 2 years, you can now see, oh, Blake's done this process wrong 3 times. Like maybe I need to send this content directly to them or have their manager have a quick training with them, or maybe I need to do a training because the whole team is doing it wrong. So if you don't have all those components of feedback loop, documentation where people need it, and then validation and like validation rules, essentially, you're not going to have an effective program long term.
I'm curious to hear from both of you. And Mark, I know you've served in high level roles across various companies, so I'm sure you have a unique take on this, but I think it's different also to create content that is technical and tactical. Here's how you create a property in HubSpot. Here's how you create a deal in HubSpot, stuff like that. And that's one layer to training and development. I feel like a lot of that can cater, especially to like new employees, new employee onboarding, standard operating procedure. But I think when it comes to especially tenured employees, a lot of times improvement is less about the technical and more about, okay, how does somebody in marketing deliver an extra percentage of QLs into the organization this month, right? How does someone in sales close an extra 2% on their close rate, which is really the end goal, right? You train and develop your team so they can perform better. You don't want someone watching a video to check a box and watch a video. You want them to perform better. You want them to upskill. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on creating that content internally, using external resources, checking for, is a knowledge check that is a quiz at the end of a video as helpful as saying, oh, your numbers are up, therefore the training video was that helpful? Do we just need to be anecdotal with correlating that? Mark, Blake, I'll let either of you take all that.
Yeah, I think in a perfect world is if somebody's crushing their numbers, not always inputting the notes when they should, taking them away from that to do a quiz to test them on it is silly and shouldn't happen. But we don't live in a perfect world, and the larger a company is, the more things are just numbers on a spreadsheet, and so they just need to have 100% of the employees do this for their incentive, whoever is in charge of that. Everything is based on what the incentives are. If the incentives for everybody was these people not failing to do whatever the training was, then it's unlikely they would be forced to. But if the incentive for, let's say, the HR person or whoever's in charge of training is to make sure there's 100% completion of this thing, then that's what it's going to happen. And so I think it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is.
It makes me sad when incentives are misaligned, because I know that if the incentive for one party is we have to make sure people understand this concept. Well, how are we going to measure they understand the concept? Let's roll out a quiz and ask them questions. And then what does everybody do? Skip the video on 2.5 speed, take the test. And what happens if you fail? What are the consequences, right? So there's that whole Pandora's box, because how often do organizations roll out a test that's pass fail, but if you fail, there's no consequence? So skip the video, breeze the test, fail the test. What happens next?
Yeah, I keep in my mind going back to the kind of trainings that are companies doing their due diligence on security of data or workplace etiquette, things like that, where it's liability, a legal thing that you need everybody to do that. But I think often people still do the same thing where they watch it on 2x if they're able to and just do the quiz. And I'm not sure the way around it.
Yeah, I feel like there's not a good way around it for those like legal compliance videos.
Yeah.
Need the ability to show like the user watched the video, they took the quiz, so something happens, you have a log that yes, they did complete it. It's not on us, it's on them.
Yeah.
It's just the world we live in with wonderful legal teams and things like that. But on the more practical stuff of like, how do I create a contact? How do I create a deal? How do I prospect to a company? I think that's where like new tools coming into the market really come into play. So like Supered, for example, you can make a validation rule saying, did they do this way? Like when the lead came in, did they put them in a sequence and call them in the first 30 minutes of the lead coming in? If it's no, you can have a rule flag saying, you did not contact this person, contact them ASAP. It's a hot lead. So like I find that more effective than a quiz because you can take a quiz and be like, yes, I understand I need to contact a lead within 30 minutes of it coming in. Doesn't mean you're actually going to remember you have to do it or do it in the first place. So I think on the more tactical stuff like that, where it's like employee needs to do X to be successful, you have to have some way to have in-app validation to tell them, did you do this right or did you not do it right? Because back to your point or earlier, Mark, you learn by doing.
Mhm.
If you do it wrong, how do you know you did it wrong? Unless you have a validation rule saying, Mark, you put this deal in wrong because you missed this and this. And then as you do that, it goes away. Like those errors and alerts will go away. So I think that's going to be the future of learning. And like our company is making that big bet personally of quizzes don't work. Long form can work, but if you're not validating and having that learning inside your system, it's for sure never going to work. Because you're going to have people like Mark where you have to do it to learn it. You're going to have people like Cameron where long form is helpful, but he wants multiple ways to engage with the content. He wants a video, he wants a map, he wants the text. So depending on his use case, he can consume it the way he needs to in that moment. And you're going to have people like me where if it's long form, I'm just not going to do it. And my manager is going to be hounding me for 2 months until they're going to say, hey, we're going to fire you unless you do this. I'm like, fine, I'll go do it. So you're going to have different personalities in your company, but the key component is you need to solve for all of them. So you need different ways to interact with it. You need validation to tell people if they did it right or wrong. And it needs to all live inside the tool they use, is my opinion on it.
So
I would agree with all of that. That's the formula. How do you build a training program that doesn't suck? That's it right there. Make it multimodal, give people information in different ways, and make sure that it's in front of them in a very accessible way, right? Making sure that it's not forcing them to learn something that's not relevant at a given time, which I think we've had some opinion on, I know, in some of the comments, but making sure that people are able to learn what they need to, when they need to, how they need to. And again, like I know we've talked about Supered a fair bit, but even if you take a specific app out of the equation and you look at whatever you're currently using for training, learning, and development, ask yourself, are you just taking content, putting it in front of people and telling them, learn this? Or are you allowing people to raise their hand and say, actually, I have a question about this because it's relevant about my role right now. And this is what I need to learn. Blake, thank you so much for being on our episode today of the Sprocket Pod. I really enjoyed having you on. This was fun.
It was a lot
Yeah,
of fun.
thanks for having me. Enjoyed
For
it.
those, absolutely. For those who don't know, again, you can join the Sprocketeer group in Slack. It is the largest independent community of HubSpot admin. You'll find many wonderful people in there, Blake, myself, Mark included. And we have almost 1,500 Sprocketeers in there. So if you are a HubSpot admin, if you're a HubSpot super fan, if you enjoy revenue operations and don't yet use HubSpot but want us to convince you to do it, join the Sprocketeer group. Link in the show notes. Also, make sure that you check in. What's that, Mark?
I said, what a growth rate. That's fantastic. You moved from Discord to Slack not that long ago and was worried that you would lose the community, but 1,500.
That's right. That's right. We were in Discord back in, I think it was October. We moved over to Slack and we had 5 people in Discord when we made that move. And now we're at nearly 1,500 amazing Sprocketeers. 1,500 amazing HubSpot admins. So it's been amazing community growth. Really enjoy interacting and engaging with everyone there. Two of my many favorite Sprocketeers are Deanna Gloff and Kyle Jepson, who, if you don't know them, make sure you check them out Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time on their HubSpot admin user group. Always a good time. And if you are curious to check out previous episodes of the Sprocket Pod, check us out on YouTube and Spotify. Link in the show notes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and Sprocket on.
Bye, everybody.